Hello everyone. For this month's book review, I read Atari to Zelda by Mia Consalvo. Before I get into the review, I just want to thank you guys. This has been a really fun year doing these book reviews. I'm almost at my 1 year point on YouTube. This is the 12th book review, so I've done one for each month. Thank you guys very much for supporting me and watching as many of these videos as you have. To get right into this book, this is more of an academic book than it is like a casual read. I've read some other ones that you could pick up and just read right off the bat, like Masters of Doom. You don't really need to struggle through the book as much. I've read some that are much harder. This tends to be a harder read just because it's like reading a textbook in some ways. The arguments are laid out in a very logical way, and they always end the chapter with her conclusions on that chapter. It's not for everyone, I have to say. Not everybody is going to want to pick this up and be like, okay, you're laying out 7 arguments, you're giving me your conclusions on those 7 arguments, and then at the very end of the book you're giving me your overall conclusions on it. That's not going to appeal to everyone. It appeals to me because I'm weird, but not everybody's going to like this. I will say there are a few issues in it. None of them are like critical flaws to the book. None of them are made me want to like throw the thing through like a window or anything like that. But if you are sort of a stickler on some of these issues, then you will get rather upset about them. She calls Pac-Man a Taito game. It was not made by Taito, it was made by Namco. Pretty big oversight, but you can kind of get past that. It's later in the book. When listing the sales of Japanese games, she goes through saying, Mario's been the most successful, and then this, this, and this. She calls Tetris a Japanese-style game. That's horribly wrong. It's a Russian game, pretty much. Everybody kind of knows that. It wasn't even it was marketed as a Russian mind game. That's because it was made in Russia, based on a Russian puzzle game called Tetraminos. It has almost nothing to do with Japan. It was just sold, like Nintendo. The rights behind Tetris are not part of this book, but they're a very confusing one. If you want to find out more about those, you should definitely watch The Gaming Historians. He has like an hour-long video about Tetris. It's awesome. It's a very confusing story, but let's ignore that for right now. What I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Mia explains is sort of the way, it's kind of like a history of how Japanese games were marketed and how Japanese games have kind of fallen off, sort of how JRPGs are not as popular as they used to be. I'd argue RPGs in general weren't always that popular. I'd say their heyday was probably like mid-90s to early 2000s. At least that's when I really cared about them, and that's when a lot of my nostalgia for them grew, because you just had a string of amazing ones released. Honestly, I would say probably from earlier than that. Probably the early 90s all the way up till probably the early to mid-2000s. You still have a few coming out, but for the most part they've kind of petered off. She goes into a little bit of how anime and video games are kind of tied together, and that's true. You had some anime that really wasn't all that popular, but slowly built momentum. Now it's much more popular than it was before. I'm one of the kids that she didn't interview me, but I can see my personality in a lot of people that she interviewed. She interviewed a lot of people that Americans that very much like anime and very much like JRPGs. That was me for a very long time. I started watching anime with Dragon Ball, waking up at, I think it was like 5:30 in the morning on a Saturday to watch it. And yeah, I fell in love with it from there. And that kind of led me into more of the Japanese video games. I knew Nintendo came from Japan growing up, but I didn't really know what a Japanese game was probably until the Super Nintendo when we got to see more of that art style, and also when I started watching anime and I saw that art style reflected in some games. I'm really sorry, but there's going to be a lot of my own thoughts and my own reflections in this book, so I will apologize for that ahead of time. I did really like the book, but it brought out a lot of feelings from me when I was reading it. That's sometimes the mark of a good book, sometimes the mark of a terrible one. But she does do a little bit here, which I found great. She tells us the differences between Western and Eastern storytelling. And I 100% agree with her. Western storytelling, you always have, it's more of the hero's journey, where you have a good guy who experiences some sort of trouble. We'll just say at the beginning his girlfriend gets kidnapped by the bad guy. He and goes on some struggling trip to go get his girlfriend back or whatever, defeats the bad guy, everything ends happily ever after, at least that's what we're told. In Japanese storytelling, it's bad thing happens, bad thing continues to happen, good guy overcomes a bad person, but the overarching horrible thing that happened, or bad thing that happened, is still continuing. He hasn't solved the ultimate problem, or she, in this case. And you find out that not only have they not solved the underlying problems, but now you find there are more flaws to your character as you go on throughout the story. Your main character might not be that great of a person. He or she might have to overcome some other crazy shit that goes on. That's sort of the interesting thing with, at least with some Japanese games. There's no closed ending. They don't close the loop all the time. It's always, you keep moving on to the next problem, you keep trying to get better. You might not actually get there by the time you end up dying. And it's a pretty heavy story, especially for someone like me, a 14-year-old playing a video game at the time. That's not what I want. And that's not what a lot of people want playing a video game. You want to progress through it, beat the bad guy, beat the boss, get whatever, and end. And that's kind of what a lot of early video games did back when, you would kill off all the aliens, that would be the end of the game, you win, you'd put your high score up on there. Okay, great. Some of the original RPGs, like the original Final Fantasy, the Dragon Quest 1 through 4, that's kind of what happened. You would defeat the bad guy, you would win, awesome. Later on, we started getting, okay, you won, but you didn't really fix everything. At the end of Final Fantasy VII, you win, you save the planet, but that, you still have shit going on. You've defeated Sephiroth, you've stopped Meteor from going in, I'm sorry, spoiler alerts if anybody hasn't played Final Fantasy VII yet, I'm sorry, but I don't care at this point. You stopped Meteor from crashing into the planet, everything's saved, but the evil corporation is still there. A lot of the people, if you didn't do all the side quests and everything, there's still bad stuff going on in this world. Things haven't, totally settled. And you always have the possibility of, a resurgence from one of the bad people from in the game, and also from the history and the myths from the previous parts of the game. It's a very fascinating story. Excuse me. And that's kind of some of the things that Mia touches on in this. It's just a lot of differences where we didn't know a lot about games at the time, and when you first started playing a lot of these, and especially for Westerners, when you first got, the mainstream gamers start getting experience with RPGs, it was probably quite a shock to a lot of us, and she points out a lot of the first RPGs on the Nintendo didn't sell that great. I mean, now you can go back and be like, oh wow, yeah, these are great games, but at the beginning they didn't sell very well, and some of the problems were localization. I mean, if you actually look at a lot of the localized stuff for Final Fantasy, 2 here, but 4 in the original series. I'm just going to call it 4, okay? Just to clear up anything. there's a lot of problems in 4 that localizations didn't do that well. It's been fixed over time, but it wasn't that great originally. And those were from the big companies, from like Square and Enix and a bunch of others. And sort of over time they've gotten better at them. But you can see Square, in my opinion, Square is like really fallen off. I guess Final Fantasy 15 was really good, but honestly the Final Fantasy series like lost me at 10 when I just stopped caring about it because I hated. I know there are a lot of fans of Final Fantasy 10, but I hated the game. Enix totally disappeared after it merged in with Square, and they still do the Dragon Quest series, but I don't care that much about it anymore. You have companies like Koei, they merged with Tecmo. They still release some pretty good ones. They kind of have veered into some weird territories now. I mean, they didn't do well with Dynasty Warriors 9, but they can still come back. And this is something that she mentions in here. A lot of the larger, like the staple companies, have kind of fallen off, mostly because they've driven some of the creative elements, like some of the core creative people, out just with their own business practices. And specifically talking about the Japanese companies. She doesn't really talk about the Western ones, obviously, because that's not the core part of her book. She talks about how Capcom was really good, and then they haven't stumbled in the same way that some others, like Konami, just, I don't know what the hell they're doing. But Capcom has stumbled multiple times within the last, I think, like 10, 15 years. They have some great successes with certain games, but they're not the same like juggernaut that they were back in the NES, Super Nintendo, and even a little bit with like PlayStation, and definitely not with their arcade games. They're probably not as good with that. I'm not a huge arcade fan. But you look at Nintendo still does like their same core first-party games, and that's generally what they live on. And that's kind of because they screwed themselves with the N64, but they're still there, they're just not the same juggernaut that they were. Tecmo is merged with Koei. Namco still exists, but they're not the same, same juggernaut that they had been. They're still putting out quality games, but it's just not quite the same. And then you have, I mentioned Konami, you have whatever the hell they're doing now, where it just seems like they shot themselves repeatedly in the foot. At this point, I don't know if Konami has any feet left with the number of times they've shot themselves. They've driven the Castlevania guy away, they just abandoned several of their IPs. They drove the Silent Hill creator out, and they just gave up on Silent Hill, to be honest with you. The last I heard of them, they tried to release a patch to get rid of PT, which I guess was going to be the next Silent Hill game. It was never really my cup of tea, but still, they just gave up on that. They gave up on Suikoden. They gave up on Contra, which I was really surprised. It was like they just never cared enough to really do Contra. And, they've given up on quite a few games, honestly. But yeah, those were those companies. Then she gets into earlier on, because I'm sorry, I went off on a huge tangent from later on in the book, but I'll try to bring it back here. She goes into the fan translation stuff, so like the ROM hacks, fan translations of games, and that was like the most interesting thing I had read in this book. It's probably my favorite part of it, and it made me remember like going through the internet trying to find ROMs of translated games from Japan just so I could play them, because Final Fantasy V hadn't been released yet, and I wanted to play it. Final Fantasy II and III hadn't been released. I really wanted to play those, and I constantly was trying to find like fan translations of those games. And all of a sudden, it got opened up to all of these other games that were never released here in the US, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. And that was all because of people hacking the ROMs, people dumping the ROMs onto the internet, and fans going out and translating them. You saw that with Mother 3. Never released here. People had to like translate the game, and you can now get the ROM online, and you can get it from crazy people who put it onto a Game Boy Advance cartridge, which, you know, that's a whole nother area. But you can find so many ROM hacks of Castlevania. I have probably six ROM hacks of Castlevania. Just it's absolutely amazing what people do. They still find these old games and they just absolutely love them. They're amazing. And like, I really wish some of these bigger companies would go back and revisit them. Some have, but not all of them. It's just so much fun to have read about this and been like, yeah, I did that. That's exactly what I used to do. And just to think about like the struggles of people having to go out and, you know, get these sort of things and actually translate them. How much time and energy they put into it. It was so fun to read. She didn't touch on a few of these, but I wanted to bring them up. The fan sequels to some of these games, like the fan sequels to Chrono Trigger, and I think there was one for Metroid. They wanted to do a fan sequel for that, and there are probably some other ones out there, but I haven't really dug too deep into it. But it was so cool to read about these things, and it was such an amazing part of this book. I wish I wish we could pull that one section out and expand on it like more. It was like 2 chapters of just awesome stuff to read. So if you don't even buy this book, or if you do buy this book and you don't read it, just read those couple of chapters, because those were probably the best ones out of this entire book. I'm sorry that I'm like totally geeking out on it, but it was just absolutely an amazing part of this book. Yeah, she goes into some other stuff about different genres for Japanese games and how they've got like a different taste or a different style, and that sometimes is how they don't get brought over to here to the United States till much later, and also to Europe. I'm sorry, I don't want to exclude them as well. But you have like some of the visual novels that didn't always translate well to the U.S. You have some horror games that didn't come over to the U.S. You have some others that were just like, we don't think the Western audiences want this. And that goes back to probably the early days with Nintendo, where they were like, we need to censor the shit out of our games because Western audiences are not going to like this. Probably the most favorite one was, oh gosh, I can't remember it right now. But there was one that was basically like like a devil game with a lot of Christian iconography in it that they just totally could not bring it over. Devil World, that's what it was. That one was never brought over to the U.S. And when you can find the footage online now, and you can find fan translations of it, and honestly there's not a lot to translate, but it's nothing. Like, you could have brought this over and nobody would have cared, but it had the word devil in the title, so they were like, nope, can't bring it. Another one from the Nintendo was Sweet Home. That was never brought over. That was a Capcom RPG, which was really cool. I have a translated version of it, and like, I really wish they would have brought that over. But I think it's probably because now I can go back and play it, but back then, you know, they were like, no, you can't bring this over because Western audiences aren't going to understand this. And the fact that that happens so much is really kind of disappointing. It was like Japanese developers didn't think that Western audiences could do like RPGs or do like heavy material, like certain horror games and that sort of thing. And you can see that a little bit with when they created Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, where they thought Western audiences had to be trained on how to do RPGs, which is kind of funny, but it's besides the point. Gosh. I could say more, but this book is just, I don't want this to go on for like an hour. I really love this book. If you can get past sort of like the more academic style that Mia takes for this, you should definitely read this, because there's a lot of information in here. As I said before, there are a few minor errors, but they're not, at least to me, they're minor. They don't take away from like the core part of this book. Uh, the the overall part, the overall book, sorry, the overall thing in this book is that Western audiences and Japanese developers are are they really do, like, Western audiences really do like Japanese games, and you can see that. I think the example she doesn't put in here, but I really wish she had, was the company Atlas. Atlas puts out just very unique RPGs. There is a pretty heavy, like, Japanese bent to them, and they really are amazing. And I wish that there were more games that were put out like that, not just from Atlas. She does bring up that smaller developers take more chances. So, like, the indie dev scene in Japan, they take more chances than sort of the bigger companies, which is true in every indie developing scene. But it seems to be, like, more pronounced, mostly because the larger Japanese companies, they don't want to, like, rock the boat too much. Which sometimes I wish more game companies would rock the boat, because let's be perfectly honest, and you can do this with movies as well, nobody wants to watch a documentary about a movie that's done perfectly. Everybody wants to watch a documentary about a movie that just goes straight to hell, and, like, there are just production issues all around and the movie turns out terrible, but everybody's trying. That's kind of the way video games work a little bit too. The big AAA games that everything goes well, and if it's an amazing game, people will talk about it for a while and it will be acknowledged that this is a great game. And there will be some lists on YouTube about it. But the fun ones are the games that are big and awful. Those get probably way more lists and talked about way more, and the companies should be shamed a whole hell of a lot more than they are. And the indie developers that take chances and do better, take chances and make a better game, those get talked about as well. And those are the games that just are wonderful. Like, it's like a hot mug of soup on a cold day, that sort of thing. And that's kind of what she gets into a little bit here, and I love it. So, I cannot recommend this book enough. I'm sorry that I rambled an awful lot, because this thing brought up a lot of memories for me, and I wish that the book had been more about some, like, ROM hacks and that sort of thing. But I'm not complaining about the parts that were not about it. It's just such a great book. If you guys have the time, or if you guys want to, definitely buy this book, because it is really, really good. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. I hope that you enjoyed the video. I totally understand if you don't, because I rambled an awful lot about stuff that has nothing to do with this book, and I do apologize for that. But yeah, just leave a comment below and let me know what you thought. Thank you very much, everybody.